The release of the FV4201 Chieftain was one of the worst decisions Wargaming's balance department have ever made, and today we see why a 13,000 damage replay taking out 2/3 of the enemy team and a game where few heavy tanks can ever go and remain intact. Stay tuned, this one's going to be interesting. How's it going, guys? It's Epsilon here and welcome to today's video where we look at, of course, one of the most broken tier 10 heavy tanks in the game, and I'm sure you've heard of it. It is the T95 FV4201 Chieftain, the tier 10 British tank that has been ruining tier 10 for quite a while, and hopefully this video is going to showcase two replays which you enjoy, and we're going to be focusing on this first one is on Lakeville obviously, and we're going to be showcasing how some of the top players utilize some of the most broken tanks in the game to have these outrageous games, and hopefully you've been enjoying the content on the channel as we've been uploading pretty much every day for like the last week or so, and it's been going really well. You guys seem to be enjoying them, and of course if you have anything that you want me to cover in particular, then let me know. But the key thing is that we've got Marcel here playing in the Chieftain, and this Chieftain gameplay is one that you're going to see both mobility of the tank, as you can see here. Actually being able to leave a flank as a heavy tank is something that you don't really see, as well as the fact that you've got this really super accurate gun for a heavy, as well as consistency that you get with the tank. You get brilliant turret armor, and you're actually better than a standard Chieftain because of course Wargaming's balancer department certainly were on top form here, and this tank can just perform really well when it manages to get hull down. And of course getting hull down is something that you may not see from some vehicles in the game where maybe you're slower and you have to reposition, whereas this one's really good at that because it can get into position and it can reposition itself and maybe use multiple hold down spots within the game, whereas some tanks in the game just do not have that capability. If you watched yesterday's video with the Maus, and of course that was crazy result with the Maus, that has no chance of being able to reposition like this one. And that's something that is always underrated within World of Tanks, and I feel like a lot of people always underestimate flexibility as one of the key drivers for people being able to have these outrageous games where you just completely annihilate the opponents. And that's really what we're trying to showcase, is that sometimes the vehicles that are best are ones that are A, mobile, have good armor to a degree, not necessarily 100% needed, but a good gun, good accuracy, and are consistent, where a player can rely upon the tank and not have to kind of hope that everything's going to go well. Something like an FV4005 probably isn't your most reliable tank, and that's probably why it's not the most competitive tank destroyer, I guess, at tier 10. But I digress. So far, a pretty slow game to all standards. If you were to see the end result, as I'm sure you've seen snippets at the beginning of this video showcasing the FV4201 Chieftain, and this is really where the Chieftain comes in quite clutch. And you can see an IS-7, obviously a fairly skilled player, finding it difficult to really pen the Chieftain at this point. And of course he's going for the cupola, which you can see here on the tank. This is a weak point, this one right here. Obviously the IS-7 just glanced off of it, didn't manage to hit it even at that close range. And I mean, trying to hit a Chieftain cupola is pretty difficult in itself, since it's low profile. If it's using a slope, it's going to be even more difficult, and it's basically going to be a big middle finger to you if you're trying to actually hit it. So yeah, that's kind of the problems you'll run into if you're playing up against this tank. But things that you can consider if you are playing the tank is you want to maintain that kind of hull armor that is kind of angled upwards, making your turret at a steeper angle, and therefore you're going to bounce more rounds, at least hopefully, as long as you can actually hit the opponents that you're trying to scrape against, or whatever it might be, or at least play up against. And now then, The enemy tortoise is in the cap, and what we don't like in World of Tanks is of course Kappa demons that just YOLO into the cap and try and make everybody lose in the game by getting absolutely no XP. So seeing a tortoise out in this sort of position where he's able to get farmed is really nice to see, especially when he's been in that cap. Now the Object 277, a fairly flexible heavy tank that is fairly fast, has kind of everything that the chieftain has, just a little bit worse in my opinion. Yeah, still not able to really reliably deal damage to this vehicle, and there you go, another top tier heavy tank dished out and sent back to the garage with this vehicle. And this is where, fighting on a ridgeline, this tank just absolutely dominates everything else, because it gets all of the gun depression that you need as a heavy, it gets the accuracy, gets the aim time, gets the reload to be consistent, and of course, because it is a chieftain, doesn't get your standard 400 alpha, I don't believe, it gets 440. So yeah, not only does it have more damage than things like the E5 and vehicles like that, it also goes above and beyond those and has pretty much everything that the E5 would want. Even if the E5 is fairly competitive in itself, it just is kind of pale in comparison and just kind of worse in pretty much every way. But you can see here, locking down the Object 277, and it's at this point the 277's realising, well, I'm automatically dead, there's a chieftain sat in front of me, farming me, locking me down in place, I can only see the turret of the chieftain and he can see the entirety of my hull, and it's basically, you might as well throw your controller at the brick wall right now and yeah, go home. But either way, 7,000 damage, well, nearly 8,000 damage has been done so far, and there is still 7,000 damage on the enemy team left to farm, and farm Marcel will do. And the Charfuture with the 4-second inch clip sat out in the open, he does actually manage to pen, and that is the first penetrating round into the tank. Does manage to set the 263 on fire, the Cobra, the Kunzerpanzer all pushing forward, aiming at the low health vehicle because you want to get those out to begin with, and then you can focus on specific targets that are highest priority. Target priority when you're playing in a vehicle like the Chieftain is super important. You don't want anyone flanking you, and you definitely don't want to be getting flanked by a Cobra who may pump a couple of rounds quite nicely through this side armor, since the Chieftain side armor, to all intents and purposes, although it does have a heat shield, is not outrageously good or anything like that, so you're not going to be able to bounce a ton. But when you turn the frontal armor, as you just saw there against the Cobra, he's going to struggle quite a lot. And unfortunately, the round doesn't enter the Cobra to remove the last remaining hit points that he may have. Now, one thing that you'll be noticing if you have been keeping a good eye on the video is that there is the APCR rounds, and he is running low. He's down to just 6 APCR rounds left with 3,229 damage left on the enemy team to farm. Now, that is not particularly the best, and you can certainly be getting farmed up by some of the autoloaders, in essence the Charfuture, who's managed to pen him 3 times, and if we go back even more, actually 4 times in total. So at this point you are relying on your STRV-103B to help you out, because with only 5 rounds left you do not have the alpha damage to actually be able to win the game by just doing the damage. So you have to rely on the only teammate you've got left, which in World of Tanks we all know goes absolutely horribly wrong in 99% of the scenarios, but he does manage to easily land a shell in the Char or in the Cobra who's trying to retreat. Now they're both back in the same bush, obviously trying to remain kind of hidden. He somehow manages to pen through the Super Conqueror's turret, even with the spaced armor of the kind of heat shield or whatever you want to call it, since it is APCR rounds and they're fairly high penetration. And I think that this is actually higher penetration than you'd expect from most heavies at the tier, 322mm. So you can go through most vehicles. You might struggle with some, but at the end of the day, still very, very good, and there's nothing you can really worry too much about. One thing that you've noted is that the standard rounds are also APCR, and this is a tank that you don't necessarily have to fire that much premium in, because you get 270mm of pen, because why not give a fairly well-rounded really good, amazing heavy tank, just rounds that are even better and allow you to basically farm up the opponents even more. So yes, you get 270 pen on your standard rounds, 322 mil of pen on your premium rounds, and your HE rounds are quite good as well, since it is a British tank and gets HESH, so 140mm of penetration with your HESH rounds, meaning that if you're coming up against things like the Char Future, like the Cobra, and you can find their kind of weaker points of their armor, then you can easily deal damage to them and you can come away with a win very, very easily. Now, one thing that is the easiest win that you'll ever come up against is a Super Conqueror up a hill exposing his lower plate, meaning that it's even easier to pen than if you were to be on the flat. So number one, really, really nice to see. But it is now coming down to the wire. Both the Chieftain and the STRV are a one-shot for the opponents, or at least the STRV is. Chieftain maybe could get high rolled, even though, I mean, probably not, but the artillery is still in the game and they could potentially take you out. You know, the artillery could be repositioning from behind, you never know, and so you have to think about this when you are playing in your own games. But STRV, obviously an easy one-shot for everything in the game. It's not going to take a rocket scientist to work that one out. You can see by the scoreboard, 778 hit points on the team. There's 500 hit points on just the Chieftain alone. So yeah, easily the STRV is a one-shot. But deciding now that the main piece of gear in the game to get rid of is that artillery piece, and if he can do that, he's going to be able to at least remove the RNG out of the game, and then maybe be able to focus on the Char Future, or manage to get round from behind the Super Conqueror, at which you could probably pen with HESH. But having done 12,000 damage, you're probably not expecting yourself to have to carry even more at this point in the game. So I would certainly be very astonished that my team hadn't already won if I'd managed to pick up 12,500 damage, but indeed it is still down to the Marcel here to be able to actually secure the victory, which the Chieftain can certainly do in 99% of the scenarios, but it's not this. It's not particularly favourable when you're having to YOLO across a field, or trying to actually push towards an artillery piece who might be sat in a bush trying to spot you, or you've got a Char Future that might also be trying to get you from just YOLOing into you, or whatever it might be. But the Chieftain now deciding to leave the cap circle. The enemy team actually got in the cap, obviously fearing that they're going to lose to cap. I'm not that surprised, and it allows our Chieftain player here to manage to go through the middle and hopefully find himself up against the backside of the Super Conqueror as opposed to the front. Now, if he is up against the front of the armor of the Super Conqueror, he does have one round that can quite easily pen with that premium APCR. But of course, when you do come up against a Super Conqueror, you do have the risk of it bouncing into the upper plate, or maybe it doesn't actually go where you aim for once, so you have to be a little bit careful. So when he's coming towards it, he's going to stick to the left. There is of course an artillery piece in the cap circle somewhere. He manages to find the side of the Super Conqueror, and with that he manages to pen as well. So somehow coming away with a brilliant result there against the Super Conqueror. The Super Conqueror does have a fairly weak turret, at least at this sort of range, and you can actually get the accuracy, but giving the lower plate, damn it, Super Conqueror, what was he intending there? Should have stayed on the ridgeline and forced the T95 to expose himself, but unfortunately for him, that doesn't happen, and a round can go into the front of the FV3 805 with just a Char Future on the enemy team left alive, and oh, yes. The Char did indeed make his return from the centre of the map. Obviously, once again, a good player in the Char to be able to have come away with a win, and obviously pick up 2 marks himself. But an outrageous game in the Chieftain that probably was just not possible in like any other vehicle that you'll see in the game. But let's jump into the second replay that showcases just a little bit something different about this tank, and maybe why it's even more broken than this one. So what better way to showcase the chieftain than playing on one of the maps that focuses on trying to get into an early game position on Mountain Pass, and this is a video, or replay at least, that showcases the aggressive push into where you typically would see things like the Kranvang push into, and of course during the whole Kranvang meta on World of Tanks you would have seen them push into this position, at which point they can hold off the enemy team who push the bridge because you have got into this position dug in, and then you've got team support from behind you, and then you're going to be able to focus on just removing the rest of the hit points of the enemy team that are sat in front of you. You don't have to worry about from behind you unless somehow the enemy team kind of YOLO push you, whatever it might be, but you can see here instantly knowing that it is time to push. Now he does unfortunately have not the best trade to begin with, but don't worry, that does not continue as the game progresses, and you'll start seeing some just insane things start to happen. And in a game where you're about half the team is tier 10 and half the team on your team is obviously tier 10, then yeah, you haven't really got too much of a worry in terms of being just YOLO'd purely, because sometimes you'll find if it's just a full tier 10 game, you might just get rushed by 4 tier 10s. No one's going to be able to hold that off on their own. But this is not one of those games, and you're actually seeing the friendly team actually push towards him as well. Now, whether their push was successful, you can see only one of them managed to actually get over here. So having the speed that the chieftain does allows him to do that. Now, unfortunately for him, he has been penned multiple times, and that is because they were able to hit the lower plate there, and of course one appears to have hit the cupola, as you will expect if you do decide to come up against this thing. That is where you want to be aiming, and obviously you still have to have good penetration to be able to pen those, but you know, if you're in a vehicle like this vehicle for example, then that should be no problem to be able to reliably go through this tank. So why make this video at all? Well, the key thing was to highlight this vehicle, show it off, see, kind of give you a rundown as to why this vehicle is just pretty disgusting, and yeah, hopefully Wargaming will do something about this one, but I very much doubt it at this point. It's been in the game for a long time, and I don't think it's going to be going anywhere anytime soon, but we wanted to check in on it considering there'd been a few new tanks at tier 10, and to see whether or not it really is as broken as people make it out. And of course the top tier players typically have this vehicle since they've had the most time on the game and been able to pick this one up at some point. And yeah, so not only do you have to compete with the fact that when you see one of these things they're pretty horrible to come up against anyway, but you can pretty much guarantee the player that's playing it is at least going to have some level of skill. Well, you'd hope so anyway. There's a bigger chance of them having some level of skill when you come up against one of these things, so be aware of that. If you see them in game, it probably means they're more likely to be better at World of Tanks than the traditional player, but that doesn't mean a whole lot anyway. But either way, 5,000 damage been done pretty well. Now unfortunately for him, I would say he's been kind of unlucky to be penned as many times as he has. Every single time he's poked, he's pretty much taken a hit from either the E75 or something. Now granted, you probably don't want to be kind of coming around that rock. You could probably pull back to where maybe the 50 TP is and poke the E75 and those in this corner over here, which would avoid you exposing any of your hull armor to the vehicles. But who am I to judge? He's managed to pick up nearly 7,000 damage within the first 5 minutes of the game being done, and why not track the Object 277? Now, can the reload of this vehicle be able to pin him down again? Not quite, and so you don't have the medium tank reload speed, but if you did, it would make it just one of the most ridiculous things I think I've ever seen in my life. But either way, the King Lurver deciding that he's had enough of being a trash bag at the back and decided he's going to be a trash bag at the front and just YOLOs in for, I don't know, well, just tomato player level plays. But there you go. I don't quite know what was going on there in his brain. Maybe not a lot, but either way, he is now in a bit of a bad situation since he's back in the garage. But either way, the Object 277 on the enemy team appears to have given up. I mean, I'm not surprised if I'd just seen a King Lurver YOLO in. Now, granted, the King Lurver probably knew that this position was going to get stormed by the enemy team, like the I-7, the FE, etc. over here. So, you know, maybe that was his reasoning, but at the end of the day, probably didn't need to push that much, and certainly not just YOLO wagon in. But this game is not won, and I have seen infinite number of games won from the hill position where you're seeing the M48 pattern there, and I have myself won many games from just being the hill camper, I guess you could say. After knowing that your team are going to lose, you kind of retreat back from J3, or maybe you retreat back from the middle, or maybe you retreat back from the opposite side. Basically, it's usually down to the fact that you've retreated at some point, you end up on the hill, and then you farm the team who are pushing forward, and you can use the gun depression of many tanks in the game. Obviously, if you don't have gun depression, it's not so nice, but yeah, either way, you're seeing here the he's just checking out whether anyone's in the bushes, essentially, and he didn't get spotted, so he knew he could come around. Now, as soon as he does that, however, he does meet himself with an E4 who he places a round into. Really nice round, locks him down, keeps him in place. He's going to be an easy shell for either himself or a friendly artillery. Either way, he's now out of the game, and you should probably be employing this sort of stuff yourself if you're deciding to play World of Tanks and you're trying to play any of them. If you just want to handle tanks like this, then utilising the kind of camo, concealment, reload, tracking mechanics, all of the basics, that is really what makes a player get good, is that they've mastered all of them. They don't make any mistakes when it comes to tracking an opponent if they want to. It's just down to whether RNG allows the shot to actually hit. You can see there, not only going for the damage, which a lot of players do, but going for the tracking assist as well, allowing him to get an extra 1,000 assistance damage. Now, once again, manages to track the Conqueror, probably through more luck than judgment there, but coming away with a fantastic result nonetheless, picking up over 13,000 combined damage, nearly 14,000 combined, so a fantastic result as well. But truly showcasing what the FE4201 Chieftain can actually do in World of Tanks, and hopefully you guys did enjoy. But don't forget, there is the video on both the Object 907 as well as my most recent one on the mouse up on screen right now, so you can check those out on the left and right of the screen right now. And hopefully you did enjoy. Make sure to subscribe if you aren't already, as we'll be continuing this daily upload schedule for at least the near future, and hopefully you guys do enjoy the future videos coming to World of Tanks. Thank you and goodbye.